Welcome to MapleWoodian.com podcast. We have on the phone Joanna Rakoff. How are you doing, Joanna?
I'm okay, thanks.
Good. You're the author of My Salinger Year. Very interesting memoir, not only of yourself, but also your interesting connection with J.D. Salinger, which we'll get to in a moment. But you are going to be at Words Bookstore in Maplewood Village tonight, so we're all looking forward to that. People can come by and get books signed and talk to you and find out about your very interesting story. Now, you're an accomplished writer and author yourself, but this talks about when you worked at the publishing house Harold Ober Associates in 1996.
Actually, it's a literary agency. It's not a publishing house.
Correct. We have to be correct on that. So the literary agency, you were there as, you describe it in different ways, an assistant in the office. Tell us sort of what you were going through at that time and what the book's about in terms of your connection with Salinger.
The book chronicles the year that I worked at this agency, which is one of New York's oldest and most storied agencies. Some people think it is actually the oldest. There's a bit of a debate about that. It was an agency that was a little bit perhaps in crisis. Their heyday had been in the 20s through the 60s, and when I came to work there, a lot of their income came from estates. The F. Scott Fitzgerald estate, Langston Hughes, Agatha Christie, people like that. They were having some trouble, or rather I should say they were resistant to adjusting their business practices and kind of office culture to the contemporary world. So they did not have computers, they didn't have voicemail, they had only recently acquired a copy machine and a fax machine. So they were somewhat out of step with the modern era, and were kind of just trying to figure out how to be in the world. There were some agents at the agency who were not resistant to this, who were younger agents who had come from other places and had big, important clients, and they didn't quite fit into the kind of institutional culture at the agency. So I, in that year, had to kind of type letters on a typewriter and use a dictaphone, and in a way my job was exactly the same as it would have been if it were 1966 rather than 1996. So it was kind of at odds with the world going on around me and with my own friends' experiences. I was 23, and so my friends were working, at .coms and startups. They were working for video game designers. They were doing things involving, digital rather than analog.
Sure. And so you write that it's the pre-digital. Now, did that help in sort of some ways to get a taste of what it was like before you entered into your own writing? Obviously, we'll also remind people you had your own novel, A Fortunate Age, which won the Goldberg Prize for Jewish fiction at the L. Reader's Prize. And you've also written for the Times, the New York Times, LA Times, various magazines. But at that time, what was it, before you get into the Salinger elements, what was it about sort of working in that sort of old-fashioned, was that a positive learning experience, or was that kind of a challenge and maybe a little frustrating?
It was both. I myself was, I think, somewhat well-suited to it, because I had come from academia. I thought that I was going to get a doctorate and go on and teach, ideally at a college similar to the one that I went to myself, which was Oberlin. That was my dream, to kind of get a doctorate, spend years in libraries researching poetry, and then go back and teach. And I found myself, in a doctoral program in libraries, and realized that wasn't exactly what I wanted to do. But I felt very comfortable in this kind of rarefied environment. My parents also are, 2 generations removed from me. So my mom now is 84. My parents were World War II generation people, whereas, most of the persons of my generation, my friends, their parents were baby boomers. They were sort of the age of I have an older sister who is that age. So my parents were kind of the generation or of the moment in which the agency that I worked at kind of froze itself. And they weren't so out of step with the world around them or anything, but somehow the ethos of the agency was similar to my parents' ethos. So I fit in quite well there, and I think that's part of the reason that my boss hired me, and sort of trusted me with this, with being her assistant and helping her tend to Salinger.
Now, tell people your quick background, where you were from and grew up, and how you got to this job at 23.
I'm from New York, sort of. I'm from a little pocket of New York that, when I was a kid, was kind of considered the lower Hudson River Valley. Now,
sure,
considered more of a suburb. I was born in Nyack.
Sure.
And actually, I'll say that the owner of Words, the Maplewood bookstore, is also from Nyack. And
yes.
Goes way back with my family.
Oh, excellent.
He was friends with my siblings, before I was born. I grew up there and also in another town nearby called Pomona. I had nothing, my family had nothing to do with anything sort of arts or culture or literally inclined. My father was a dentist, so before he became a dentist, he had been a comedian and an actor, and his own father actually was also a dentist on the Lower East Side, but was also a huge theater person and wrote theater criticism for one of the Yiddish papers. So there was a kind of strand in my world in which, my parents were huge readers. They went to the movies, to the theater all the time. We went to museums constantly. So, we partook of culture, but no one in my family did anything that I do now. They're all scientists. But anyway, I was always a little bit unlike everyone else, and I went to Oberlin, spent a year in London at University College London doing a master's, came home, worked briefly, or really dropped out of the program, and then worked briefly as a PA on a Barbra Streisand film, and then fell into this job at the agency.
So you were doing a lot of different things, but did you have a push to want to write, or?
Yes, I had always been, I was a kid who wrote, at some point in adulthood, I ran into my second grade teacher while I was home on a visit, and she said to me, "Oh, are you still writing such beautiful poems?" And I didn't even remember that I had written poetry when I was in second grade, but I suppose I had. My mother at one point dug up my elementary school's literary magazine, and there were poems by me from third grade and fourth grade. So, yeah, I had.
Now, it's interesting, you write a lot about, the book is really an interesting mix of your story and of Salinger. When you got in there, you talked about sort of the view you had of Salinger, but sort of how that changed. You hadn't read a lot of his stuff, but you really had to dig in to read almost everything about him. How did that sort of initial venture into his world go?
Well, actually, I had read nothing by him. It wasn't that I hadn't read much. I had read nothing by him. I actually was actively not interested in Salinger. When I was a teenager, The Catcher in the Rye is very commonly assigned in high schools. It was not.
Oh, yes, we read it too. But you didn't have to read it?
No, it was not assigned in my high school. Some teachers, I believe, did assign it, but not mine. Mm-hmm. And my parents had his bookshelves in our house. Had his books on their bookshelves, and I saw them, and I knew that my parents really liked his work. That my sister and my other siblings who passed away had really, really liked his work. But I found myself thinking that it was too light, too cutesy, too sort of mainstream for me, that I was interested in more kind of difficult, gritty, realistic fictions. I thought his work was kind of just comedic and silly, and I just was not interested in it. I thought of myself as a scholar of literature, and at the time, Salinger was not a writer who, in academia was sort of being championed or studied. Now he is, but he wasn't then. And I just kind of avoided Salinger. I just wasn't interested. But over the course of that year at the agency, a lot of my job had to do with answering Salinger's fan mail.
Right.
And the fans would write letters in which they revealed bits and pieces of his stories. There, was a lot about the Catcher in the Rye, but also a lot about all the stories having to do with the Glass family, Franny and Zoe,
right,
Banana Fish, and I, began to get a feel for what those stories were like, and became curious about them, and also curious about what his work was like, purely because it had so dramatically affected so many people.
Mm-hmm. I think, like a lot of people, whenever I catch the Rye, it had an effect on me. I'm my own more of a reporter, writer, but that he kind of slammed a lot of the sort of cultural and social status. We didn't like this very angry student, Holden Caulfield. He's upset, he's angry, he lashes out. I think a lot of people took that maybe in the wrong way. It's sort of hard to tell because he had done so few interviews about it. But now the situation was the literary agency would get these letters. Salinger wouldn't answer them. You would answer them. Is that the usual situation, or is he kind of an unusual person because he was so famous and so reclusive? Did that seem like an odd setup, and how was that to be answering letters for him?
Well, let me just go back and explain that. So, first of all, it's unusual for a writer to receive the volume of fan mail that Salinger received.
And so many years after he stopped writing.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, his books, continue to sell in millions of copies, and they never.
He's an unusual case.
Slacked off. Yes. Yeah. So Salinger. The second thing to bear in mind is that Salinger, in the 50s and 60s, was as famous as a film star. He was as famous as, I don't know, like, let's say, Angelina Jolie or someone like that. He was as famous as anyone that you'd read written up in Us Weekly. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He was receiving bags of fan mail every week. People would line up at newsstands early in the morning on the day a new Salinger story was supposed to appear in the New Yorker in order to get them before they sold out, to be the first people to get their hands on them. So his fame, his celebrity, really needs to be understood. It can't be underestimated when we think about what went on, with him in general, with his sort of retreating from the world, and also from his deciding to discontinue answering his fan mail. So then I should explain that he did indeed answer his own fan mail for many years.
Right.
But in the early 60s, he started to become overwhelmed by it. He did a truly incredible kind of heroic job of answering it. He entered into correspondence with people. He was incredibly generous and helpful. He was just wonderful and lovely, and wrote, some great letters to people. He also was a huge letter writer in general, and had correspondences with friends and what have you. So he was writing a heavy volume of correspondence, and also trying to work on his own work, and had children and a wife and what have you. And you can read, especially his letters to his a friend of his, Michael Miller, who is an artist who did the original illustration for The Catcher in the Rye. Those letters are at the Pierpont Morgan Library in Manhattan, and they're so wonderful to read. They're moving, they're hilarious, they're just great. And you see you get more of a feel for who he was, and just what a great person he was. But anyway, in 1963, he just became overwhelmed by the fan mail. He had some bad experiences. He also started receiving some death threats from children, and he became afraid, and he said to the agency, I just can't do it anymore. And they developed a form letter, which said, Dear so-and-so, Miss so-and-so, thank you for your kind letter to J.C. Salinger. As you may know, Mr. Salinger does not wish to see his fan mail, thus we cannot pass on your letter. Thank you very much. It was on the harsh side. And so every assistant that had held my job since then would type and retype this letter many, many, many times to everyone who wrote something to Salinger, no matter who they were, no matter what they said, that was the letter that people got.
But in the book you write about putting some specific personal comments or responses on a few. You write about one girl who was curious about Franny and Zoe, whether Franny was pregnant or not, and you added a line sort of personalizing. How often did that happen? And I could imagine you're responding to people for this very famous author and wanting to know different things. How often were specific things sort of answered, or was that rare?
I would actually describe it differently. What really happened? I mean, I should explain for listeners who haven't read the book that this is part of the plot of the book.
Right.
So what happened?
And to credit you, it reads really very much like a novel. It's a very specific, detailed, descriptive piece, which is really difficult to do, I think, with nonfiction. And you pull it off very well. But go ahead.
Thank you. So part of the plot of the book is that these letters are dumped on my desk, and
right.
I start reading them, and they are so wonderful. Almost all of them are many pages long. They sort of fall into a few categories. There are, of course, just crazy people who are writing to him. I'm obsessed with Salinger. There are a lot of veterans of World War II who write to him feeling that Salinger has really captured their experiences during the war in myriad ways. There are people who write what I call the tragic letters. They're pretty much how Salinger helped them through really difficult moments in their lives, or just how they sort of clung to Salinger's work while, say, their children were dying or their spouses were dying while they were undergoing chemo or that kind of thing. And then there were letters from teenagers who often wrote in the voice of Holden Caulfield, sort of like, "Dear Jerry, you old bastard, I get one hell of a kick out of it if you'd write back and tell me that I was a crumb bum," that kind of thing. So I found myself just increasingly drawn into these letters. I was fascinated by them from the start, because from what I knew of fan letters, they were more like, "Dear Taylor Swift, I love your music. You've perfectly captured how I feel about high school. Love, please send me a photo. Love, Monica," or whatever. They were, sort of brief little juvenile things, but these were letters from real people, not from kids, from people of all ages, all over the world, really pouring out their hearts to him and being so honest. They were almost like confessions, some of them.
Right, you write in the book, I now understand why the fans wrote to him, not just wrote to him, but confided in him in such urgency, with such empathy and compassion, with such confession, because the experience of reading the Salinger story is less like reading a short story and more like having Salinger himself whisper his account into your ear. Were you surprised at sort of the way people respond to him, or after you read through all of his writings, as you mentioned also in the book, did it make sense, or is it still sort of unusual the way people gravitated to him?
No, I understood. Just as that passage said, I understood. It made sense to me. And so, yes, that is why I started writing back to some of them personally, because it just felt wrong and difficult to send a form letter back to someone who had spent 6 pages explaining how her daughter had died. It just felt very harsh to me. I was 23. I was very earnest. And I felt that I had been charged with a kind of impossible task. And so I started responding personally, not to every letter, but to, the ones where it just felt too hard to send a form letter.
Now, one movie that we had come across last year, Salinger, filmed by Shane Salerno. Do you know of that one, or?
A lot of people do. I mean,
that was a very interesting piece. He kind of dug around and had stories of trying to find Salinger up in the mountains, and it sort of painted him as a little bit afraid of the public eye, or more that he didn't really need the public eye. What was your take on that approach, and just in general how you saw him, because you write about having spoken to him as well. Was his sort of reclusive approach at the end surprising, or a comment on him? How did you sort of take that?
Well, it wasn't at the end. I mean, he retreated from the world.
Yeah. Why do you think? I mean, is that just because he just had enough, as you say, even with the fan mail alone, and people were begging for more writings from him?
Right. Well, he had actually retreated from the world even before he stopped answering the fan mail.
Yeah.
I mean, he had grown up in Manhattan. He lived in Manhattan. He, went off and fought in the war. He went back to Manhattan. He lived in Westport, Connecticut for a bit. He eventually, when he was quite young, actually moved up to Cornish. He married, moved up there. His wife, who was from a very sophisticated background, she was English, but she had grown up a lot in Manhattan, from a very wealthy family, was not quite happy there. She found it, very isolating. Their initial house didn't have electricity, and they were really kind of going back to the land, and she was somewhat miserable. He sat in his he had a sort of detached study, and he sat in it all day and worked, and when they had a child, she was just kind of left alone with this baby for 12 hours, and she actually ran away from him at a certain point, went back to her parents saying, I just can't live in this kind of isolation. So, I mean, it was decades that he lived in this isolated state. It wasn't like he did this at the end of his life. But he did, talk to people in Cornish. He was part of Cornish. This is the town he lived in, Cornish,
right.
New Hampshire. He was part of that town. When he, was younger, in the earlier years, he was more part of it. But it wasn't like he was some kind of strange hermit recluse who never spoke to anyone. Like, the people at businesses in Cornish all knew him. He left his house. His last wife was from Cornish. She was a nurse. He met her there somehow, and they were married. She was much younger than he was, but they were married for many years in the end. And by all accounts, she was a lovely person. She is a lovely person. So, he retreated, and I think he was perceived as being kind of eccentric hermit. But in a way, he was retreating, first of all, simply from the kind of hubbub of city life, which he realized was not for him. During his final stint in New York, he just was miserable. And I think there's a way in which, if you've read the stories about the Glass family, a lot of those stories are the stories that are focused on Seymour and on his famous character Franny Glass are very much about having trouble just coping with the world, with people's egos, with other people's kind of, Holden Caulfield would call it phoniness, being thrown at you, and with all the sadness and heartbreak of the world. The story, in the stories Franny and Zoe, Franny, who's a college student, who's beautiful and brilliant and loved by everyone, and successful, by all accounts, and sort of on her way to this kind of golden life, it just kind of collapses because she just can't take it anymore. She can't take all of this. And she essentially has a nervous breakdown, and no one can understand why, but she's really kind of having an existential crisis. Part of it is that she's in mourning for her brother, Seymour, who's killed himself. That's definitely part of it. But she's also just kind of in mourning for the world. This is he's writing about the post-war universe in which it's the 1950s and everyone was kind of pretending to be happy, but in reality it was like the world was on fire, like Europe was destroyed. You had these men millions of them who had fought in the war and were pretending that everything was great, and they had these great jobs and were making money and had wonderful cars and families, and yet they had witnessed people being blown apart in front of them, and they weren't supposed to talk about it. So, that is what he was kind of writing about, and that was also his universe. He himself had fought in this war, had seen these awful things, and been part of them himself. And I think all of this is partly why he retreated, somehow being in the city with all of this sadness when other people's distances thrown in his face all the time with the loud sounds, everything was just too much for him, and he just wanted to be in the country alone, in a kind of peaceful place. And in terms of retreating from the public, from the media, this is just my take on it, but I just do think that he just wanted to write, and the demands of the public interfered with that. Whether or not he was actually writing, because of course he hasn't published anything, I don't know, and I can't speculate on it. I will say at the agency, everyone really trusted that he was, that something great was going to come from him, but I don't know if that's true. They knew him much better than did I.
No, the other interesting thing is how, now there's never been a feature-length film of Catcher in the Rye. From what I understand, is that something that we'll ever see, or is that something he was against, or did that ever come up in your time there?
Salinger did not allow film, did not, and his estate will not allow film adaptations of his work. One of his stories was adapted, I believe, in the 1960s, and he was very, very unhappy with it. He actually loved film, and in his later years, he loved TV, and he was very excited about this film initially, and like truly, genuinely excited. And then this story of his was turned into, a kind of mawkish, schmaltzy.
You remember which movie that was?
Film. I'm sorry?
Which story that was?
I'm trying to remember.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it's too early in the morning here for me.
I'm sorry, we can track that down. But it is interesting because he could not only first of all, he would have made major amounts of money, and he would have seen the work up on the big screen. A lot of people who maybe not have read the book, although I think many people have. But I guess there's also the idea that I think authors want you. There's a certain part of and you as an author know better than I. There's a certain part of the reading experience where you can sort of visualize things yourself. And when it's up on the big screen, it kind of takes a little of that away. I don't know, is that the way he thought it, or did he just not think it would be handled right because of the incident you mentioned?
It was both. I think it was more of the latter, that his works are designed to be read, not proto films. So he, did not, he just was vehemently, adamantly opposed. He also would not allow his work, for instance, to be excerpted. So when I worked at the agency, people would call and say, I'd like to put this story in an anthology, or I'd like to use a bit of Catcher in the Rye in this anthology, and that was not allowed. He very much wanted control, and he felt like the stories in 9 stories are meant to be read together in 9 stories.
Interesting.
If you want to read them, you can read them on their own, or you can go to the library and look up the magazine in which they initially appeared.
The other example that's always interesting to me is the book Shoeless Joe, which the movie Field of Dreams was based on. In the book, the writer kidnaps J.D. Salinger and takes him on this cross-country trip. But when the movie was made, Field of Dreams, with Kevin Costner, and James Earl Jones plays a Salinger-like character, but he's a different character. They changed it, and I believe there was, as one of the stories at the time wrote, that Salinger's attorneys basically reached out and said, we don't want him depicted in the movie. We didn't want him depicted in the book, but we will let it go. Essentially, that's what the one story said. So there he is, and that's even more understandable that you wouldn't want to be depicted in a story, a fictional story. But that's another example, sort of how he protected his image, as many writers do.
Yeah. Well, if you just step back and think about it, would you want yourself to be portrayed in a movie that has no basis on your life? I don't know that I would want that.
Yeah, that seemed very odd, and it was sort of a comment on his office that they really didn't go after the author of that book as much as they probably could have, but sort of let it go, but made sure that in the movie that didn't occur. We will let you wrap up. We could be talking about this for hours. I appreciate it. We're talking to Joanna Rakoff. She will be at Words Bookstore tonight in Maplewood Village. Her book, My Salinger Year, is great reading, whether you're interested in writing or in an interesting personal story or Salinger himself. One last thing, what is sort of the next for you? You're out on tour for this book. It's doing great. It's a great, interesting story. But what should people look for you down the road? And what is sort of your overall take of Salinger, having gone through this interesting experience? And then we'll let you go.
Wait, I'm sorry. I'm confused by the question. What is next for me, or what is my take on Salinger?
Both. Two different questions to throw at you at once, just to be confusing.
Okay, well, I think I've conveyed my take on Salinger. He's a great American writer. In the book, if you read the book, you'll see he was very kind to me, and I'm, still indebted to him and grateful to him for his kindness and his kind of guidance in a way, and just for kind of showing me what it meant to be a writer, the graciousness with which he kind of, I felt, walked through the world. Other portrayals of him I know have been different, but that's how it was.
Well, let me ask you this way. I'm sorry. What is sort of what's the one thing you remember, one moment, either talking to him or meeting him or anything that your job there and your connection with him allowed you that stands out, either the way he spoke to you or one incident involving him that stands out?
Well, I would say there are many, but one is he was a really good listener, despite the fact that he actually was pretty much deaf.
That's right. You talk about that in the book, too.
And he, would call and to speak to my boss. And I had been told, don't keep him on the phone, don't chat with him, don't ask him any unnecessary questions. But he would then ask me questions, and I would be very nervous because I knew that I wasn't supposed to be talking to him, and I didn't want my boss to come out and perceive the situation to be me keeping him on the phone. So, but through just some small remarks that I made, he figured out that I read poetry, and then that I was writing poetry, and I had been afraid to tell anyone this because it seemed so kind of earnest and silly and sentimental to be writing poetry, and I didn't think that anyone would take me seriously. But Salinger, of all people, did, and he would call and say, so are you waking up and writing every morning? And would sort of check in with me about these things. And it was through that I really did start waking up and writing every morning. I wrote a whole novel. Waking up at 4 a.m. before my son woke up, I still do that to this day. So that's sort of a big thing that he gave to me without, even really intending to, just sort of chatting with me and just being a generous person who kind of paid attention to the people around him.
Excellent. And then about your next step, your next projects.
I'm in the middle of a novel that is called Money or Love, and it's set in a smallish town kind of near Albany called Ghent, and also in Brooklyn, in the kind of Cobble Hill, Borum Hill part of Brooklyn. That's about mainly one family that kind of becomes destitute after the global economic crisis of 2008. It takes place in 2010, but it follows a few families who are kind of going through different things following that crisis. And it's very much about the way the world economy affects little people's lives, affects everyone's lives. Definitely the backdrop is money.
Excellent. Well, we'll remind people you will be at Words Bookstore tonight in Maplewood Village with My Salinger Year, a very interesting account, memoir by Joanna Rakoff about her time, and also your own writing and venture into Salinger's world and connections with him, but also a very personal journey and story. Again, well written, as it really flows like a novel, like a story, but with obviously nonfiction elements, because it's a true story. And we can appreciate your time, and we'll see you at the bookstore, and good luck with this and all your future endeavors.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to coming. I love Maplewood.
Excellent. Thank you very much.